One of the hardest days of my life was to tell my parents that I can't do this. I'm not going into the ministry. I can't do it. I was raised in the church, the oldest of 6 children. My grandfather was a Methodist minister. As I grew older, I felt a call on my life, or at least I felt a call on my life to go into ministry. And at the age of 14, I began to really try to respond to that call, and found myself at the age of almost 15 beginning to actually preach and going out into churches and preaching. When I was about 16, I noticed that I had an addiction to pornography, and in those days, in the 70s, pornography was not as readily as accessible as it is now. I found myself going to college at 18 thinking, okay, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to beat this addiction, and I went to college to study to be a pastor. This double life soon led to an addiction to alcohol, drugs, and I found myself trying to acquire a degree in ministry and also battling my own personal demons. So I found myself at the age of 22, I dropped out of college, and instead of trying to live that double life anymore, I just decided, hey, I can't do this, and I give up. Found myself becoming a musician and a singer, and found myself in my first rock and roll band. And at the age of 23, I just knew this is what I was supposed to do. And so I got me a guitar and got me a cowboy hat, and I thought, this is my new identity. This whole 25 years, my addiction to alcohol, my addiction to marijuana, cocaine, had gotten out of hand. I was finding myself, driving back and forth to Nashville every week, drinking while I was driving, getting high while I was driving. Didn't realize just how out of control my life was becoming. Then when the elusive record deal didn't happen, and I came home, every dream I had kind of just went away. I developed an addiction to methamphetamine. And so 5 years later, my wife left me. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know I had an addiction to methamphetamine. I was flipping through the TV station, had cable, didn't have heat, but had cable. And this TV preacher got my attention. And I'm not a huge fan of TV preachers, but this TV preacher said something that got my attention. He said, how would you like to change your life? I said, I'd like to change my life. And I said to him, I suppose you're going to show me how to do it. And it was just like this TV preacher was talking to me. He said, if you really want to change your life, pray this prayer with me. And I said, okay, with a bunch of expletives inserted. I began to pray the sinner's prayer with this TV preacher. And the thought entered my mind that hadn't entered my mind for a long, long time. And the thought was, do you think you could get sober? And I remember thinking, how could I get sober? Why would I even want to get sober? Why would I even consider it? But as I looked around and I saw what condition I was in, I thought, is this really how I'm supposed to live? What if I quit smoking marijuana? Oh, I can't quit smoking marijuana. How am I going to function? How am I going to get through the day? But at the same time, this other voice said, but what if you did? What if you did? What if you were able to quit? I got in my car that morning and I drove out to my mother's body shop. My father had died several years earlier, and the family has a business, and I begged and pleaded for a part-time job, and they gave me one. And I remember showing up to work that morning. It was about 10:15. I'm standing on this car, and I can't tell you how or why, but something happened, and I remember turning the sander off and looking up to the ceiling as if God were that ceiling, and I said, God, if you're real, take this methamphetamine addiction away from me. Little did I know the significance of that moment, because what happened at that moment, what came over me was this total release. I realized that my guilt rushed out of my body, out of my heart, and out of my mind. And then the second thing I realized was I just got saved. And so I went in and I told my mother my story. It wasn't 5 minutes later. And I remember telling my mother, this is going to be the first sober Christmas I've had in 25 years at least. And I remember telling her every detail of my life. And I remember the feeling of relief that came over me as I shared all the terrible things that I'd done in my past. And my mother just put her arm around me and said, I love you. One Sunday morning, a man by the name of Jerry came up to me and he said, Rick, he said, do you realize that for 25 years that your mom has been in a Sunday night prayer meeting, and every Sunday night for over 20 years we prayed for you? And I remember thinking, so that's why I'm here. That's why God chose to move in my life. That's why in the background He was always in my life. He was always moving. I just didn't know it. One day I stopped long enough to listen. 6 weeks ago, I preached my mother's funeral. And I remember thinking, as I preached her funeral, if it hadn't been for her never giving up, I wouldn't have a life today. I wouldn't have Christ in my heart today. And I remember as I stood over her casket and preached her funeral, I remember just thanking her, because my mother never, ever gave up. So today, my life is all about honoring her memory, carrying on the tradition, and sharing with people the fact that God can do what you can't do for yourself. Just about every day I get an opportunity to tell people God did what I didn't think He could do. I'm Rick Wilson, and that's my story.